Well, good afternoon. It is 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. So I just want to acknowledge and thank you and appreciate all of you who have hung out here and thank my colleagues for being here to spend this time together. The workshop has been very interesting thus far, and I think this will be a great finale for our day and a half. I'm Bonnie Thornton Dill, and I am one of the co-PIs on the HuMetrics project, and I'm also a co-PI on the Breaking the Mold project that we will talk about this afternoon. I'm just going to say Breaking the Mold is a leadership training project that's focused on developing particularly leadership among faculty of color and underrepresented faculty in the arts and humanities. And my colleagues will say a lot more about that. I also want to say I'm on the faculty at the University of Maryland, College Park. Our project involves University of Maryland, College Park, University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and Morgan State University. So our colleague from Morgan couldn't be with us this afternoon, but we will hold up their banner as well as our own. So, I want to begin. We've been talking a lot, certainly in yesterday's session and some today, about HuMetrics and its relationship to assessment. And that's certainly the way I came into and got involved in and learned about HuMetrics. But as I began working on this project, Breaking the Mold, I began to think about HuMetrics in relationship to leadership development. And I would say that our project, in many ways, began with HuMetrics as a workshop that we did, and everybody had a little HuMetrics experience. And then that was the first year. And by the second year, we were like, no, we need this to infuse this more throughout. And so it's kind of that transition, and I'll ask a question about that a little bit more. But it has been that transition, I think, in terms of how we think about and use HuMetrics and how we think about what we now refer to as values enacted leadership, that I really want to talk with, that we want to talk with you about this afternoon. So I'm going to say briefly, introduce my colleague, Kimberly Moffitt, and Psyche Williams-Forson, and I'll let you say a little bit about yourselves and as we do this. And I'd like you to say a little bit about who you are and what you do. But then I'd like to ask you, because we are going to be talking about leadership and how we envision a future academy, if you would give us in your introduction perhaps an example of a memorable or rewarding experience you've had in the academy thus far, in the academy as it is, as a leader or through engagement with other leaders, an experience that you'd like to see more of in the academy of the future. So, Kimberly, do you want to begin and just introduce yourself and maybe answer that question?
Sure, sure. Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to be here and discuss something that I think is really exciting in terms of the work that we've done with Breaking the Mold. Kimberly Moffitt, I serve as the Dean for the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences here at UMBC. I've been in that role for 4 years. I've been on the faculty at UMBC for the last 17, a professor of media studies in the Language Literacy and Culture PhD program. Thinking about this as a question, Bonnie, I kept coming back and I said, oh, it's going to sound so, planned to mention Breaking the Mold, but that's what stands out to me as a perfect example of experience I've had in leadership and working with others that has really resonated in a very positive way for me. I think so much of how we, as I refer to us as 20th century scholars, came to the academy, it was so focused, and some aspects still are very much focused on the individual, right? What you acquire, what you achieve, what you pursue. And a lot of it is how you then create your identity as an academic and a scholar, which is very much in that silo or isolation, alone by yourself and separate from others, even though you may share or exist within a discipline. But Breaking the Mold as a leadership development program really did this interesting thing, which I'm very appreciative of Mellon for doing, of bringing together, first of all, 6 women. That's the first part that I loved, is having an opportunity, a space in which I was with 5 other women who were really interested and committed in similar efforts around leadership, that I thought, I've never had this experience in the academy. So that stood out to me first and foremost. But then when I think about what the future of the academy looks like, I'm hoping more of like Breaking the Mold will exist. And by that, what I mean, not just specific to leadership development, but the collaboration, working across disciplines, engaging others in terms of how they are looking at this work, and pulling on all of our disciplines. You know, we've got some folks that are coming out of the arts world. We've got some folks as PIs that are definitely grounded in the humanities, and bringing us all together and being able to strategize about what and how we want to move forward for our colleagues who are participating in the program. And I have found that very rewarding. I have not entered into that space saying it has to be done the way that media studies scholars look at it, but being able to draw on American studies or gender, women, and sexuality studies, being able to draw on arts administration. All of these are many of the disciplines that we've been working with or that our colleagues are from, that I really think speaks to ways in which we can collaborate and have something really successful, but also something really interesting and innovative that allows us to be able to draw on and provide as a resource to our colleagues who are thinking about leadership.
Thank you, Kimberly. Psyche, you want to?
Well, Kimberly, you stole my thunder, because I was also going to speak to Breaking the Mold. I'm Psyche Williams-Forson, professor and chair in the Department of American Studies, also at the University of Maryland, College Park. I've been there now for 19 years, and it's both exhilarating, but also a little sad that it has taken 17 years to get to the point where I would say that I have found a project that really does excite me. I look forward to every Friday morning at 8 a.m. when we come together to talk about what are our plans for the next week, what are our plans for the next session, what are our plans for the next year. And I'm really, I pretty much echo everything that was said by Bonnie and Kimberly, and would add that it's exciting to have this project in the humanities, especially because, you know, we take it for granted in some of the other disciplines in colleges, but in the College of Arts and Humanities, where collaborative work is not always rewarded in the same ways, it has been a really fabulous opportunity to not only work with my mentor and friend, Bonnie Thornton Dill, and now Kimberly Moffitt, but also just to watch other colleagues in the college get excited about the project. We started out with 8 participants in the first cohort. We had 9 in the second cohort, and then we had a transition, so we ended up with 8. And now potentially in the third cohort, we may have 10. So I think that speaks to the work that we're doing on our campus, the word that's getting out within the college, and the fact that you have more folks who are recognizing that they may potentially want to be involved in leadership activities than perhaps they had initially assumed. So just to piggyback, and this is, not a cliche anyway, in any way, but I do think that breaking the mold is probably one of the most rewarding projects I've been involved in since I've been at College Park.
Hmm. Well, Kimberly, why don't you say a little bit more about what we're doing in breaking the mold? Yesterday, Sahar, Camise, who has been in one of our cohorts, was on this call, and she spoke and she talked about her experience and how it had transformed her life.
Oh,
And
wonderful.
so I think people are curious to hear what we're doing. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. And we are in the midst of doing our interviews for our cohort, our third cohort. And so we've gotten a lot of questions about this from those who have applied to the program. What I would say is, and aspects of this are always ever evolving. And I think that's the beauty, again, of the humanities, that we don't have to be so fixed and rigid about how we want to move forward. But what stands out in particular is Mellon being very committed to saying, when we look and do a survey of higher ed in leadership in particular, and I'm speaking specifically about president, provost, VPRs, those types, it tends to be overwhelmingly folks who are from STEM disciplines, or at least STEM adjacent disciplines. And Mellon approached us with this idea of saying, we're missing an important element to what the humanities can contribute to higher ed leadership. And in doing so, we were tasked with being able to create almost a pipeline program in which to address that very point. And so in particular, the program, we see it as being along two tracks or parallel tracks, where we are focusing on making sure that we support our colleagues who are not full professor to make sure they are moving in the right direction on their scholarship so that they can actually become full professor. What we know based on the literature is that there are quite a few, especially in the arts and humanities, women and faculty of color who tend to languish for a much longer period of time at the associate professor level. And as a result, we know that that means they don't have access to some of these important leadership roles in higher ed or on a university campus. So that becomes a very important spot or a benchmark that we need to get folks to, so that they can then even have access or be considered for some of these opportunities. So that becomes important to us, to make sure that we are supporting our colleagues with what they may need towards their research. The program offers them some additional resources, financial resources, to do some of that work. But at the same time, we're also talking about leadership development. What do you need? What are the skills that are missing? What are the ways in which we think about leadership that sometimes humanists don't focus on as much as someone who happens to be running a chemistry lab and has a number of PhD students and postdocs that are already there for them, and they then become tasked with managing this whole team of individuals. That doesn't happen often in the arts and humanities. And so the opportunity for us to really help our colleagues think about what development or what skills they need in order to develop as a higher ed leader becomes very important, which is why HuMetrics becomes so important to that conversation, because in line with what work we do as humanists, we ensure that we also focus on the values-centered approach of understanding that your values and how you see the world and what you think are important also influence how you develop your leadership style, and how you then decide to carry out the ways in which you lead. And so those two pieces, I think, are the big parts of the program. And then there are a slew of activities we do during the year. I don't know if you want me to keep giving some additional pieces, Bonnie.
Yeah, well, maybe Psyche wants to
Okay,
add in.
so I've got plenty more.
Yeah.
Psyche,
Psyche, you're on mute.
Okay. Before we get to the activities, I wanted to add something to what Kimberly was saying one of the resources that we offer is the opportunity for each cohort, members in each cohort, to apply for a grant of up to $50K to fulfill a larger project. And I'm sharing this because it's fresh in my mind that Bonnie and I just finished reviewing. We had 4 applicants, and we finished reviewing their proposals. And not for the first time, what we're finding is that folks in the humanities have a difficult time connecting their research to their leadership, right? It's there, but they're not used to communicating it in a way. And so we see the value, right? It's very much infused in their research, but they maybe need another paragraph or a couple of lines to say, how do you see this being a part of a larger leadership plan? In some cases, we had to tease it out in their proposal and say, well, we see it here, we see it there. But I thought that just really speaks to how much we are not attuned or practiced in thinking about ourselves as leaders. Though we do this incredible work, mentoring, for example, folks tend to think that's just mentoring, but it's not. There's a form of leadership there. And depending upon how you view it and you package it to wider audiences, it becomes work, as we've been talking about lately, along a continuum of leadership activities. It may not be always at the senior executive level, but it might be. But it may be somewhere along that scaffold. We also, one of the activities that we implemented was a shadowing experience. And Kimberly, you can talk more about this, but we asked our cohort members to identify folks across campus whom they might want to shadow for a period of time, a couple of hours a day or what have you, to learn more about what actually takes place in that role. And we've gotten some really excellent feedback. And some of those folks are in VP positions, some are deans, some are directors of centers, which again, just really illustrates the range of leadership opportunities that are available that folks very rarely ever think about. People are pretty focused on dean, provost, and president. And we're like, there's so many other interim or intermediate or even just other opportunities that exist. And that's part of the real rewarding part for me of being a part of this program, is to say, what about the work you do planning this very extensive lecture series, and bringing intellectual knowledge of different ranges to a variety of people, not just on our campus, but beyond. There are elements there that you should think about and capitalize on. So that's one of the or two of the activities, I guess. The $50K grant, we also offer a $10K travel and research grant. And then again, on our campus, we've also taught our cohort, our colleagues, the difference between your CV and a leadership resume, which I think was also a very well attended, very well received, and very well discussed workshop that we held over the winter break. Just to see light bulbs going off and people by the end of the workshop being able to perhaps communicate very quickly, or this is how I see myself in a leadership position, or this is how I see myself and the trajectory of my resume as a leadership resume versus the 40 pages we have as our professional CV. So those are just three or four of the activities we've done at College Park that I think really exude the values, but also trying to help folks think about the conflation of their research, their values, their research, and their leadership.
And so I want to just add to that, because I think you're spot on. And I know you refer to it as leading along the ladder, that it's so important for us as artists and humanists to even capture that, because we don't think about these moments of mentorship or, on certain committees or, running searches as being some form of leadership. And so even the conversation of trying to help folks think about it differently, instead of just saying, oh, I'm a leader when I'm dean or provost, that it becomes much more than that. and you just need to have the right words to be able to illustrate what that is. The other workshop or discussion that we have with our cohort is around the organizational chart of our campuses.
Yeah.
And that always seems to blow folks' minds, because you've got your little slice of life within that department and you think, I get it. I am a cog in this big wheel and I know the wheel. But what we find out is a lot of folks don't know that wheel at all. They just know their little slice of it within the department. And then they tend to, as I tell my colleagues all the time, they tend to start making stuff up. Right? You know, whatever, because humanists can be real creative and we know how to tell narratives. And so we fill in, you know, some of what we may not understand, believing that it is so, when it comes to how the university is structured and organized. And so it's been really fascinating to hear how folks engage and talk about the organizational structure and what they learn about it when they didn't know the number of positions that are on a university campus and what those particular roles do, and just then opening up their world to see how vast these systems are, that we're much more than just faculty in departments that are teaching students, that there's so much more that is happening on a college campus that makes everything go and run smoothly.
Yeah, you know, and I think in the context of our imagining a new academy, that knowledge, providing that kind of knowledge for faculty who are coming up through the ranks and who are learning about, is really key, because without an understanding of the context that they're in, of the structure, and I think one of the advantages of this program has been the 3 different kinds of institutions. I mean, when we started out, UMBC was not a research one. And in the course of our time, has become a research one, which has created all kinds of new challenges for faculty there. And of course, Morgan State is an HBC, historically Black college and university, is an HBCU, and the differences in terms of the clarity about values and mission, the resources available to people to get certain work done. Learning about all of that is kind of learning about the context and the culture of higher education. And that, I think, is also something that's happened here that's been important. So, you know, one of the things I wanted, you know, I mentioned at the beginning that we had kind of shifted from one workshop on HuMetrics to a very different kind of way of thinking about values and leadership. And I wondered if you would talk a little bit about how you see that shift having come about, what it represents to you, and yeah, in terms of
So I can be brief on this. I think Bonnie, you know, in our first year, we had it as this kind of one and done workshop. Like, let's show you how HuMetrics works, and let's play with these index cards and see what comes out for you as your values. And we did that individually, but also as a cohort, with each cohort. And it was very interesting, but it felt just like one and done. And the evolution of what we have done now with it, so that it becomes a starting point for us, and that we continuously go back to it throughout our time with each cohort, is exactly the way it should be, because then it speaks to the core of the work that we're doing. And again, coming out of the humanities, the approach of centering values to then be able to speak to how you are engaging, how you are choosing what leadership roles that you want to explore, how you are making decisions in those leadership roles, because we do have faculty members who are already serving as chairs, that are already center directors or graduate program directors. They are already leading along the ladder, to Psyche's point, but here's an opportunity to put into words and to see in action what they are actually centering as the way that they're choosing to lead, which I think comes through in the HuMetrics program. And it's really also interesting, one of the pieces that we are seeing in this round of interviews with our third cohort, that you hear colleagues talking about it, talking about what their values are and how they are drawn to a program like this, because they're hoping that space is available and created for them in which to do so, which looks very different than some of the traditional ways that we think about leadership, right? That you don't bring yourself to it, that you have to stay disconnected and just carry out the work and not, you know, talk about those things that are important to you personally or professionally. But we are doing this differently and letting folks know, no, you need to bring self to the table, and you need to also be able to bring those values and also espouse those values so that others know how you then are making decisions in your leadership, in your time in leadership.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, and I think that also our infusion of HuMetrics throughout the year has also manifested in many of the activities that folks are doing outside of the program. So, for example, serving on a search committee. I've heard some folks suggest that they feel more empowered to explain why we should be looking at candidates in certain ways, both with their credentials, but through different lenses. And some of that comes about because of this work that they've done with HuMetrics, and they feel as if, oftentimes they're the hidden variables that aren't talked about, and they feel emboldened to now do that. Two of the things that have happened with our cohort at College Park, in the first year, we found out recently, two of our colleagues have developed a concept for a minor that they want to introduce. They knew each other before this, before breaking the mold, but through conversations that we had around HuMetrics and other workshops, they began to talk a lot further and have now developed this concept. In our second year, the entire group worked on a concept, which they delivered to us at the end of at our last session, for an outstanding program that I do think will come to fruition. But it also allows them to think about where they can plug in around campus, Arts for All, or in the Frederick Douglass Institute or some other entities that we have on campus, where they can be a part of those activities in order to see this proof of concept, or to see this concept come to fruition. So I think for us, HuMetrics has operated, back to what you said, Kimberly, on an individual level, but also it has enabled folks to see synthesis and cohesion with their colleagues, both those in the cohort and just in campus and on at the college level in general.
I just, Bonnie, if I can just add very quickly, and I know HuMetrics has a life before the pandemic, but I do think the timing of us utilizing HuMetrics and breaking the mold when we started really coincides very nicely with having experienced this life-altering event, right? Global phenomenon that a number of us on that individual level started to do, an assessment of like, how am I moving forward as a person, as an academic, as a potential leader on a college campus. And HuMetrics puts many of those things of how we're thinking about life it puts it in action for us to be able to engage in a way that we may not have been before. Again, that whole notion of being disconnected from your work because there was work to be done, so you carried it out for the institution, but you didn't engage it on this values-based perspective. And so I believe, having come out of the pandemic and now moving forward the way that we are, that folks feel more comfortable bringing more of themselves to the table in how they are choosing to lead, and not believing that they have to be disconnected from it.
Mm.
Interesting, interesting. You've said a little bit about this, and I'm interested in what, and I'll say a little bit about how I think about, because I think in many ways this experience in breaking the mold and combining it with the experience with HuMetrics and the things that we've been working have really changed how I think about leadership in major ways. And I'm interested if it's done that for you, and what that might be. Do you want to jump in, or do you want me to?
No, I was just going to say, I can just, I mean, I think my last response is speaking very much about my own journey. You know, I became an interim dean during the pandemic. All of our institutions closed mid-March. And by August of that year, I was the interim dean of a college that was operating, or a university as a whole that was operating fully remote, that we were trying to make this magic happen for our students still without being in, you know, company with each other. And I truly believe that for my own self, of making some assessments of how I was doing life, the way that I looked at doing my work, that HuMetrics as a tool really became a way for me to say, oh, it is okay to bring part of myself to this work and share it with my colleagues, not just bring it to this role, but to be able to share it out, to say, here are the things that are important to me, and here is how you will see it show up in my leadership. And so every summer since then, I meet with chairs and directors, and we have a conversation about how the year has gone for them in the department, what they're hoping to set as goals moving forward. But even before they get to that, I start every conversation to say, here are the values that I started the year with, and what I was interested in seeing in my own work. And I'm sharing it with you because I want you to also hold me accountable for it. That I'm telling you that transparency is a part of how I lead. Is that what shows up in the given year? Or can you say, no, you really weren't transparent with us? If that's a value of mine, you should see it, right? You should see that I am espousing it to you, even if I mean, clearly there are certain things that I can't share, but otherwise wanting to give you as much information as possible, being a part of that value system, it should be obvious to you. And so I've enjoyed being able to kind of share out, like, here are my values. This is how you will see me making decisions, or how I have decided how I'm moving forward as the leader of this college, and allowing my colleagues to try and hold me accountable for it, to see if I am actually walking the walk, or is it just words on a paper.
Psyche, you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, that's great, Kimberly. I haven't gotten there yet, partly because you know, I'm a chair of this is my 9th year, so I'll be moving into my final year at the close of this second term. And this is really helpful for me to think about, both as I transition away from this position, and some things that I want to share with the next chair, to think about, because when I came into this position, it was so brand new. And everything was catching up and trying to put into place the things that weren't there. And so I hadn't had a moment to really think through, what is it that I want to communicate to the faculty. You know, I have directors that I supervise, as well as staff. And I think going into this last year, this is something that I do want to share. It's a legacy that I can leave that I would then impart to the new chair. I would hope that, you might consider taking this approach, because we implement these things on a daily basis and may not necessarily think about them. But here's an opportunity for me to communicate them and really work to meet them publicly, right? So that what I say I'm going to do is what I'm really going to do. And for them, as you said, to hold me accountable. So thank you for sharing that, because even though I've been working with HuMetrics for the last several years, again, when you're just working to put together an infrastructure that's solid, sometimes you forget to communicate those pieces to the folks with whom you're working on a day-to-day basis. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, I think for me, I said this has really changed the way I think about leadership, and I've been struggling a little bit because I realized that, and I was asked to talk about this, so I had to stop and think about it, Psyche. Otherwise, I might have might just keep going. But I realized that one of the things that I was saying was that I think we spend too much time thinking about, and you started here, Kimberly, a little bit. We spend too much time thinking of leadership as a personal project. You go and learn this, and you get this skill, and you get that, and you do that, and you add it all up, and then you're certified as a leader, right?
Mm-hmm.
And really, what I've come to see, and I certainly think this is true for what I would call transformational leadership, is that it really is collaborative. It is, I mean, you don't lead yourself by yourself, right? I mean, that it is collaborative, that it's relational. That it's relational and involves relationships and building relationships and knowing kind of how to do that. At its best, it is inclusive. It is intentional. I think just what you talked about, Kimberly, the more intentional you can be to say, okay, this is how I want to start out. Did I make it? I mean, that's the relationally intentional part. And all of that is, it has to be values led in order to do that. So I've been thinking about the fact that our fellows in the program come to us. Many of them are associate professors, going to full, maybe some assistants on the verge or in under review. But it's like when you become a tenured professor in an institution, there is some leadership that's expected of you. And you are called on to lead in a variety of ways. You may not be called on to be department chair, but you are called on to chair commit, as you said, chair committees, all of these kinds of things. And so understanding these aspects of leadership and the ways in which you make your values, you move them from abstractions to strategies and tactics for accomplishing certain goals and outcomes that you are all trying to achieve, is important wherever you're leading. And so I think that this has just kind of helped me think about this and provide some language. I think that's the thing that HuMetrics has given me in many ways, is some language to talk about some of the things that I've done and have been doing, and to kind of reflect upon them. Are there any other impacts we should be
So
aware of?
I'm just going to share a quick anecdote where, again, those of us trained in the 20th century, of how we were taught to be academics. And I remember talking to many of my mentors when I decided to apply for the deanship. And I told them some of the things that I wanted to be able to convey that were values driven, right? That centered who I felt like I was. One of those stories was to talk about the significant impact of losing my parents, and how that had served for me to think about how I want to serve in higher ed. And immediately they all told me no. They said, no, you can't, no, you don't, that has nothing to do with this. And I sat with it for a bit, and the end result was I still decided to share. And I did so because I used that particular story to talk about why then I see centering people as my first and foremost important value. Why, when I introduce myself, I always say Kimberly Moffitt, and I serve as, I don't say I'm the dean or dean of. I always say I serve as, because I see this as not, I'm here, heels dug in, I'm going nowhere, because I see leadership as something that's ever evolving. And so, yes, this is the role that I am serving in right now, but there'll be some other role that I'm serving in. Maybe it's being back with my PhD students and mentoring them and guiding them to be that next generation of leaders. Whatever it may be, this is a temporary position or spot that I see myself playing, which has a lot to do with how I thought about service and what my parents poured into me thinking about service. And so I do think those types of aspects of who we are and bringing them to the table. Again, I've had a number of folks say, nope, too much information, too personal. But I really believe that if I'm able to share aspects of that, you get to see my values being espoused, but you also get to see a little bit more about Kimberly, so that you understand a little bit more about how she's thinking about things, what's important to her. And again, if I'm centering people because you hear these stories that I'm sharing about how important people are to me, then that helps you to understand my decision-making. And I just think it's important for leadership. And I think that's the beauty of Mellon wanting to see more artists and humanists at the table in higher ed leadership, because we do need more of that. And if you think about where we are as a nation, politically, globally even, there is aspects of this that really do require us to bring more of ourselves to the work so that we can find ways to dialogue, engage each other, and civilly figure out how to, work through some of our challenges instead of making it a business decision only.
Mhm.
Yeah, to piggyback on that, Kimberly, I like what you just said, because as we're chatting, I'm thinking about something that we've often heard or said, and that is, we weren't trained to be deans, we weren't trained to be chairs, we were trained in graduate school to be scholars, right? And so I'm thinking, so then we appoint people and we hire people to these leadership positions with no training, right? And so as I'm thinking, I'm like, maybe I need to do a little retreat with my directors, undergraduate director, grad director, USLT director, and both undergraduate directors rather, this before we go into the fall, because I need to know what scares them about this work, the blind side of it, right? I think we take that for granted. You don't know what you don't know, but there are a lot of elements. And as I'm thinking about my colleagues who'll be taking on some new positions, I'm like, they're clueless. They have no idea what they're about to get into. So meeting with them to say, hey, what is it that you need to know? What do you need from me? What do you need from the rest of the colleagues in this department in terms of support? What do you need in terms of guidance? How would they know to ask those questions? And so here again, in terms of leading along the continuum and the ladder, I think we have to start even there. We mentor students. We are training young people to be the next generation of scholars. How do we want to do that? How do we show up in that process, right? I think we've spent a lot of time being opaque, and it's time to be a lot more transparent and to say, I really don't know. I've had to say to some of my students, this is probably not the best degree for you, right? You should probably be getting a doctorate of practice, right? As opposed to a doctorate of research. And I think that the ability to be able to say that to a graduate student without this assumption that I was trained in, which is if you're not going into the professoriate, don't tell anyone. They don't want it. Yeah, but that is all changing, right? And like you, I had a similar experience as I was going up for promotion, where I was told not to share some information in my portfolio. And I did it anyway, because I thought it was important for this committee to know, while chairing a department, I had authored a book while trying to get a child through high school who happens to have some special needs, et cetera, because you needed to know how this resilience factors into my seeking promotion. Again, I was told, don't put that in there. But as I said, I did it anyway, because why wouldn't I show up as a whole person, right? And I think we have to start thinking along these lines. If the pandemic told us nothing else, it did tell us we show up as whole people, and we are affected on so many different levels, from those before us to those who are coming after us, many of us being sandwiched in between, and all of that affects how we lead. It affects how we show up every day to do this work. It's not as if we can divorce ourselves from it. So, rightly or wrongly, I just have decided, one, I'm way too old in life to play this game anymore. I'm just going to tell you, I can't do it, or I can do it, or I'm at my limit, or what have you. But I have to be honest, because if I don't, it's going to show up in my work.
Well, and that's also, Bonnie, last comment. It's also about the future of higher ed, because I think, again, if we are doing that as leaders, what impact is it doing for our young scholars, right? Who will be the future leaders of higher ed. And so I am always overjoyed going through the faculty search process, and candidates show up and they unapologetically talk about the type of research they're doing. And they aren't, fixing themselves in that nice, neat bubble that's considered safe to be able to talk about the type of work you're doing. But they're talking about, some of the work that might be tied to some of their identities. And and talking about how they want to extend that research and take it into communities and work with communities on some of those very issues. That, I think, is also a part of when you are making sure your values are part of the work that you're doing. And so when we, as our 3-campus cohort, met last Friday, when we had, Dr. Lisa Brock sharing what she has done as a leader in the academy that has continued to center social justice in the work that she does, and how it shows up in the centers that she runs, in the ways that she mentors young scholars. There were so many of our faculty members in the cohort that were just floored. Like, finally, I'm hearing that there is a spot on that ladder, that leadership ladder for me, that I don't have to relinquish all aspects of who I am in order to fit into this box of what it means to be dean. But I, in fact, do get to bring some of that to the table. I have to present it in a different way, but it still gets to exist because I am that whole person, to your point.
This is really great, because as we were talking, even in the session that was just before, one of our respondents or participants talked about their vision was being an academy of full participation where everyone flourishes. And it seems to me that what you were talking about really is a space in which you can fully participate and flourish. And you can, I was struck by the fact that, Psyche, that you talked about naming your fears, having people name their fears. And I think we don't kind of allow space for that. So I was really interested that you brought that in, because that also seems part of full participation.
No, I was daunted, for example, when within 6 months of being chair, I realized, because I had been in the department for so long, that it was time for us to have an external review. Bonnie, you'll remember this, because Bonnie was dean when I was chair. And I was like, oh my gosh. And I talked to him with my predecessor, and she was like, yeah, don't say anything, because they'll ask you to get ready to do it. And I said, no, well, we have to, because it's been 8 years. And so when I started doing, I was totally overwhelmed. And I was very nervous, because I said, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't want my department to be impacted in a negative way. And I had to sit with it for a very long time. And then I just jumped in and said, let me rely upon what I already know about this department. And then let me think. And so I was forced to think very carefully about what our needs were as a member of the department, now looking at with a wider lens and with a bigger picture. And, you know, again, I think we ask folks to take on these roles within the department in other senior leadership or along the lines of senior leadership, but do we ever ask them, what concerns you the most, or what fears do you have about taking on this position? We have a cohort member who has repeatedly said, I'm not ready because I've got some other issues family-wise that are preventing me from moving forward at this time. And I think that is very honest, because so often we would want to say, don't say that, you know, because people think less of you. No, he's got 2 small children who he has to be mindful of, and that may compete with his ability to take on these roles that we might see him fit for. Why wouldn't you say that? Because we've been taught, keep your personal life away from your professional life. But in the academy, we know those two mesh and meld all the time. Colleagues bring their kids to campus for activities, you know, because they can't find, you know, childcare. Our kids go to the same college. I just noticed today that our current dean, her son is in grad school at Maryland, you know, and who knew, right? And it's all on social media, right? Because he's got on all this "Go Terps." And we are whole people. I don't know why it is that we have bought into this notion, although we kind of do know over time that we should not show up as the whole people that we are. Flaws and triumphs, challenges, lives and death, all of that goes into how we do this leadership work. One last thing I'll say, my mentor when I was in graduate school, another one of my mentors said, look, this is not an extra part of your life. This program is your life. It's a part of your life. She said, people are going to be born, people are going to die, people are going to get married, people are going to get divorced. All of that happens while you're in this journey toward the end of this process. So she said, if you're always looking to the end, which you should be doing, but forgetting the journey, then you miss so much of the training that you need to be on the other side. And I thought that was, I added that last part because that's what I've learned. But she told me the part about people living and dying. But I tell people all the time, so much of the experience is in the process. It's not at the end, right? And so that's part of what I want to share with my colleagues as I step out of this role and transition into doing something else.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I would add to that, Psyche, because I love how you framed it, that, you know, again, that future academy should be the space where we're able to bring our full self, but it should also be a space where we can do some self-reflection and not be criticized for it. Because again, so much of how we've been trained is we're supposed to be the experts in a particular field. And so you don't question, you know, like it is what it is. And we lose the fact of the human side of us that should be taking assessment along that ladder. Like as we are leading, we should also be reflecting and thinking about what are the ways to tweak and twist and turn something that we've been doing that might look a little different than how we've done it before. But you can only do that when you're open and willing and able, without, you know, someone coming to attack you and say that you're not good at it, to be able to do some of that self-reflection. Because I think that gets lost too, because of the imposter syndrome, and you're not really as great a leader as what you thought or someone else thought, because you're taking a moment as a human being to say, I need to do some self-assessing here to figure out where I am. And I think that for me is also a part of that future academy, where we are able to take account and look to see what those values are. And maybe the values then change, right? And we do something else with those values, that the space that we're in, based on some of the experiences we've had. So I think that part is really important for me too.
And I also think that these last couple of months in higher ed and what we're seeing play out on the national landscape is begging for that level of
That's right.
self-reflection.
That's right.
I can't help but think how many folks who have been before Congress or what have you have thought, if I had just stuck to what I know to be true, I
Yes.
wonder if I would be in the
Yes.
position that I'm in now, balancing what you know to be true with the needs of the institution
That's right.
and not foregoing one for the other, but doing both. We're seeing this play out throughout the nation, how various elements of our lives are under attack and assault. You have to show up in particular ways where you where you're able to push back and hold at the same time the values of the institution, but not sacrifice your own in doing that.
That's right.
So this has been fascinating, and I know I can hear my HuMetrics colleagues over there with so many things to say about this conversation. But I really did want to kind of keep looking at values, because we're talking about values enacted leadership. We're talking about what we do in the workshop, and we're looking at kind of outcomes or the ways, examples of how it's shaped our work. So I want to bring Chris Long into the discussion. Chris, I'm tempted to call you the godfather of HuMetrics, but I won't. But I can just hear your brain going as you've been listening to Kimberly and Psyche. So I wanted to bring you into the conversation first, and then we'll open it up more broadly.
Oh my goodness, Bonnie, thank you so much. And just such a gift to be with all of you and to be part of this conversation. It's so beautiful to hear. And so thank you. I want to begin with that. Just thank you, Kimberly and Psyche and Bonnie, for sharing your conversation with us in this format. I also want to enter into this conversation with Toni Cade Bambara, because she was in my mind as you were talking, and at the beginning of that amazing book is Velma Henry, who is having a breakdown, and Minnie Ransom, the healer, who is challenging her. Are you ready to be well? Are you ready, sweetheart, to be well? Minnie Ransom is saying. And then she says, just so you're sure, sweetheart, and ready to be healed, because wholeness is no trifling matter. A lot of weight when you're well. A lot of weight. When you're well. And then later on in the text, one other, Velma's grandmother, Sophie Hayward, says, have to be whole to see whole. Have to be whole to see whole. And so I feel like defining the kind of leadership that you're talking about as practices of wholeness. What might that be for us? And what might that make possible? It requires practices of presence, which I've heard all of you talk about. Kimberly, your reflection on the importance of self-reflection really is important to keep in mind as we move through this. And I think some of the work that we've tried to do structurally in our work here at Michigan State, and I think Sonia Fritchie is on the call here too, from Estonia. So Sonia, you're here. She's co-collaborator on this work around charting pathways of intellectual leadership, which really is an attempt to rethink the tenure and promotion process, among many other things, by not only shifting the framework from teaching, research, and service to sharing knowledge, expanding opportunity and mentorship and stewardship, but then most, I think, importantly, is to build into the annual review process opportunities for self-reflection and documenting what you're learning. So exactly, Kimberly, what you were talking about in your practice as a leader, how are we inviting our faculty colleagues? And it works with staff, and it works with non-tenure system faculty, and it works with tenure system faculty, it works with all of us, to pause and reflect on what values do we want to enact in our work together, in where we're going, and then the willingness to be vulnerable when we don't, because we don't live up to it. We let ourselves down and we let each other down. But that's part of humanness too. And that's why I think, Psyche, you were mentioning fear, naming fears. I remember, I don't know, Penny, if you remember this, and when we were charging the one committee, we did a values enacted committee charge, and the committee was going to do some hard work around, oh my gosh, summer pay for faculty. It was going to be quite a big situation. And what the committee did in the first meeting was, let's just name our fears. What are we most afraid of? And it was just such a beautiful moment, because some chairs were saying, well, I got a couple of faculty members I'm kind of scared of when they hear what we're thinking about doing. What is that going to mean? Are we going to be able to support each other when that goes down? And it did go down, I will say. So, but we had thought about it beforehand, and so we were able to be with each other in the moment and reflect back on that. So I really love the way you all were articulating leadership as practices of wholeness. I mean, that's what I was hearing you saying, Bonnie, and it's collaborative, it's reflective, and it's not afraid to bring, your full self as best you can. That doesn't mean there's not boundaries and things. There's boundaries, yes, of course. But Bonnie, this is an interesting conversation for me to listen to, because I think I remember you and me having a conversation a long time ago on the campus here at Michigan State. We were walking back, I think, to the Kellogg Center, and I was just going on about vulnerability, how important vulnerability was, and you were holding me accountable. He's like, okay, well, you're a white guy, being vulnerable for you is a different thing, and now I'm listening to you three, and it's like, this is it. You're talking it. You're telling me, be vulnerable. I'm ready. So I think it's just been fascinating to see the way that this work is being taken up, and I'm just grateful to be part of it.
Well, Kimberly, Psyche, you want to say anything, or I'll open for questions or participation more generally? I think at this point, the group is a Friday afternoon intimate enough group to so that if people want to raise their hand, say anything.
We can. I want to just comment on what the last thing you said, Chris. I mean, you raise a very important point that Bonnie, pointed out. There are calculated risks of being vulnerable. Absolutely. Though we didn't necessarily say it explicitly. Yeah, you kind of have to weigh what those situations are, and how much do you share? To what extent do you? I mean, you can't. Just for lots of different reasons, you don't necessarily need to be full on and full out, but to take a calculated risk and be honest about some elements of what how your values get played out and what your decision-making processes are, I think is very important. I was telling Bonnie this on our campus. The students have their alternative social media page, and they've decided to name the president in a way that he may or may not know, and it's not pejorative at all. But what I hear from them, what I hear from undergrads, is they believe that the president will do the right thing. And that makes a big difference. These couple of years into his presidency, that they think he will do the right thing just based on some decisions that have been made. For example, in one set of conversations, we had a very rough fall, and the decision was made to let students go be virtual for Thanksgiving for the first 2 days, and then to take off a little early. And there's students out there who are like, we really like and appreciate Papa Pines for doing that, because we think he heard us. Yeah, we think he heard us because we told them we were tired and he was listening to it. Why do I bring that up? Because this is our next generation of students, of grad students, and their infusion with social media and what gets posted on social media and the way we show up in that arena, they take it all at very much at face value, right? And so I think it is important for us when we're being our transparent selves outside of the academy to recognize those things are overlapping. So those days of keeping it separate are gone unless you just don't have a social media presence, and then you're considered lame, you know, so they don't want to be bothered with you anyway, right? But to know that, you know, students are watching and they're watching how you are in your presence outside of your role as whatever, but also in that role. The two are being fused very much.
I see Sonia has a question. Sonia, can we let you in on the chat if you want to? It'd be great. There she is.
Hi, yeah. It's late, so if I don't talk completely straight, it's about 11:30. But this is fantastic. I just am loving this, and I'm just taking all sorts of notes. And you know, every time I read Brene Brown and she talks about vulnerability, and I say, but women leaders in vulnerability, the minute we're vulnerable, it comes back at us, right? I mean, it's weaponized. It's we get attacked for it. We're not given opportunities. It's hard to know. The higher up you go, you know, the harder it is to share any of that. And I'd be curious to know, you know, how do you navigate that? Because I mean, I've been talking values for a long time, and there are still things that I just keep so close because it's too much.
I would just say that, yes, absolutely. They are all calculated risks. And I am always seeking for those commonalities that I think a lot of us as humans share. It's real easy for me to, another quick anecdote, the day of my interview on campus for the deanship, where I had to do kind of a town hall for the college, and faculty and staff came to ask random questions. I started that conversation because this was about me. I was going to center myself and make myself calm before I had to engage with a series of unexpected questions. And I started the conversation with the fact that as I was walking to that meeting, my son, who was graduating from high school, called me to tell me that he had just gotten into his top choice college. And in that moment, of course, I'm elated for him, right? So I enter into this space, and I start there by saying, again, finding commonality. The number of my colleagues who I know are parents, that they may be parenting in some way, that they are connected to other young people. And I'm like, who can't enjoy this moment that I'm celebrating, even though it's mine and my son's? Of course, other people can identify and connect with it. So I started there. I said, you know, I just got some of the best news that I possibly could have received at the opportune moment as I'm entering into this room. And I said, so there's very little that's going to shake me off of that spot right now, but please bring on the questions and let's engage. And so I think those are the kinds of moments that you have to take advantage of. And again, very calculated, right? Because I made that about me, but I made it about me in a way that centered and showed people my values and what was important to me, that even though this opportunity for this professional moment was important and I would love the chance to be dean, I also love being somebody's mom and seeing them happy and successful. And I want to share that with you so that you see that side of who I am, in hopes of us finding a commonality or a common experience that we can share with one another to be able to move forward together. Again, just elucidating just a bit more about what my values are and who I am and how that will impact how I choose to lead going forward.
Yeah, you know, I think that that's so important because Sonia, you talked about calculated risks, and that's also what Kimberly was saying too. And it's the calculate. I mean, I do think as women, and for us as women of color, there has to be calculation. You don't just step out there. You have to know your audience, you have to know the climate, you have to know a number of things. You have to know where your support is, who are your allies. All of those kinds of things as you think about kind of how much you're going to share and what you're going to share with whom. And so I think those seem to me to be the operative words: calculated risk. And then also, what matters most to you? I mean, what is it that if you say it and people go crazy, you're like, hey, this is me, and this is what's important to me. And y'all can go crazy if you want to, and if you want to run me out of town, well, I'll go, because this is what I think is important. So I do think that calculation part of it is really key. Other input or others, anyone who wants to kind of add in at this point? How are we doing time-wise? We have a little bit of time. Comments or anything, Jason or Nikki, you want to?
Well, I just want to, here, I'll see if I can come on camera here. My upside down. Hold on, my camera's not. There we go. Hi, how are you? So just first of all, thank you so much. This is such a fantastic conversation, and I learned so much from all of you every time I hear you talk, and I'm just really grateful for the many lessons that you're sharing, particularly from the Breaking the Mold experience of leading that experience. But I'm wondering, so you've spent a few years now with the project, you've worked with a number of folks in the cohort. And I'm wondering if, and I'm really struck by this sort of like the seeming ease of the immediate impact of just setting a different tone about like, let's share our fears up front, like these sorts of things. And I'm also mindful, like in the previous session, there was some conversation about how, like there was a lot of hard work that went into changing tenure and promotion, but then a lot more hard work that came after in terms of really bringing through the implementation of a policy that had been adopted, but culturally there needed to still be a lot more change, right? So there's these two sort of models perhaps of culture change, one that's like immediate and maybe low-hanging fruit kind of impact, and some that are like longer interventions and changes. And I'm just curious, have you or the folks in your cohorts identified sort of the most, like what are the things that they've identified as the most necessary changes so that we can center the value or the values of the humanities at our institutions? Like what's the low-hanging fruit where we can orient towards change, in like that example? And what are some of the more significant investments that we need to make? It's a big question, I know. So, but I'm just really struck by the examples you've already shared, and I'm wondering if anything has come up from the cohorts you've worked with.
Well, I think that one of the things that folks are invested in, aside from just the DEI conversations, right, that they do see as the sort of low-hanging fruit, are looking to see how administration is responding to these changes in higher ed. Part of identifying our values, let me say it like this, and Sonia, I think this will tie in a little bit to what your comment. We're all fortunate to have the positions that we have, to have the paychecks that we have. But we have at least one cohort member who repeatedly, no matter what session we have, is going to push back. They say that's their ethos. That's what they do. They push back. To the point where they were told by another colleague, sometimes you don't have to do that work. You can just be quiet and watch and see if other people are going to pick up that banner and run with it, or that baton and run with it. So to your question, I'm not sure that this necessarily gets at it, but also to yours, Sonia, for me, when I talk about the fears and the transparency, it depends on what I'm prepared to lose. And if I think I have lost, I have to ask myself, as this person walking through this earth, what am I prepared to compromise on and what am I not prepared to compromise on? If it doesn't cost me my job, and at this point in my career, I feel like, you know, there are maybe a few things, but more things that won't. Like any other activist, I'm prepared to say, this is where I am, and this is what I need, or this is what concerns me, or troubles me, or gives me pause, or makes me fearful, right? That's part of the calculation. What am I prepared to lose? If it means I don't get the job, I don't get the job. Then, as Kimberly's president said to us, then that wasn't the position for me, and I need to be okay with that, right? But what I don't think I'm prepared to do is to sit back and just say yes to everything when it makes me compromise my value. So for a lot of the folks in our cohort, that's where they are. Several of our participants are like, you know, I'm willing to do this type of work right here because it aligns with my values, and anything beyond that, that's going to cause me to kowtow or what have you, whatever they see as their position, I'm not willing to do. And I think that we're at a point generationally with the students who are challenging us to think about this. And certainly we saw this coming out during and coming out of the pandemic. Life can end at any moment. How do you want your legacy to be on this earth? If it's going through saying, yes, I'll do this, that, and compromising your values, good for you. But many of us are at a place where I'm like, unless it's going to cost me my paycheck, in which case I need to think about it anyway, right? If you know, as our former provost said, we don't want to see you on the front of the Washington Post. Well, that depends. It depends on why I'm there, right? Because if I'm there to protest something that I firmly and wholeheartedly believe, then that's okay for me. And if it means I won't be chair next year, that's okay. If it means I won't be teaching at this institution, that's something else I have to think about. So again, that's part of the calculated risks. But I think folks are at that point where we're really saying, what can I afford to lose and be okay? Again, I don't know if that answers your question specifically, Jason, but I hope it straddles a bit of what you were asking and what Sonia is suggesting.
Yeah, and I'm going to start there, Psyche, that I don't know if this gets to where Jason is going. But, you know, I do think the fact that Mellon came to Maryland and spoke to these three presidents and said, we want to see you craft something like this is very telling, because they felt like this was a space that would be open to it. And given us that latitude to try and create something like that. But even greater than that, after it was you know, it left the presidents and came to us to actually carry out, you know, the number of times Mellon has had other institutions contact us and other even, you know, states to try and pull together another sort of initiative like this among a few like-minded institutions, really seems to be telling me that they have their finger on the pulse of understanding that this is a direction that needs to happen, and they're willing to put some money behind it to see it come to fruition. But they want to see, and they've explicitly said to us that they want to see this successful so that it can be replicated in other spaces, because they know that this is what's needed for higher education leadership, but they also know that it's the way to tap into the next generation of academics and what they desire out of this. That this, again, is not a separation of our bodies of what we can bring to our work and what we can't. There are so many people. I tell folks all the time that in my 17 years at UMBC, when I got here and I wanted to do certain things in the community, that was seen as kind of this add-on. You know, you do that and in addition to what your scholarship is. Whereas now we have so many people that show up at UMBC saying, this is who I am, this is the type of work that I do. And if I'm coming here, you need to understand that this is where I will start. This is how I will engage. So those are the next generation of academics who will then be the leaders of higher ed. And so we need to know how to engage them now so that they do understand and know that what they are bringing to the table does have tremendous value and will show up in the reflection of what we believe our next, what the future academic communities look like around this country and world, hopefully, that it's not going to be separate and distinct.
You know, Kimberly, to some extent, I wanted to say this earlier and it left my mind. What looks like disruption today is the status quo that we're all trying to reach tomorrow. You know, community engaged scholarship about 10, 15 years ago, nobody wanted to touch it, right? No one wanted to touch scholarship that involved your family. Now you got something called
scholarship.
It wasn't scholarship. Now you have autoethnography as a whole subdiscipline, right? And you have community engagement, which is on all of our campuses or many of our campuses, right? So in some ways, I see us as relative change agents using disruption in ways to move forward these conversations that have long since needed to be changed. Because I tell you, I think a lot of these young folks who are coming behind us, who we're training, are going to take up that baton. As I said, they're going to push it. And so we might as well begin to think about the ways to meet them where they are and to learn from them as we move forward, because, you know, we don't know when the next pandemic may come, and we may be pushing even further into ways of being that we had never thought of before. Zoom, right? 5 years ago was not even a thought. And now it's a mainstay of our lives. How do you even have a meeting without Zoom, right? And so I think that those kinds of things are testaments that I can't always be afraid. I need to just, if it makes sense and in that moment to think it through, then I should push it. And I think that's what HuMetrics has encouraged me to do, really.
And, you know, Jason, I would say, based on that, that the low-hanging fruit is both recognizing that we are change agents and the way in which what we are doing is disruptive, but also the other low-hanging fruit is telling our stories. And really telling them more widely and more broadly. And I think that's what this convocation has done. I mean, we've heard from people yesterday and today about things that they're doing, things we had no idea or we didn't, you know were going on, things that were exciting and energizing to the rest of us. It's like, oh, we're not alone here. And so I do think, and part of the problem is that when you're doing the work, you often don't have time to tell the story. And so figuring out ways to do that, and taking the time or working with people who can help us take the time to tell those stories, I think that's the immediate low-hanging fruit. Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Yeah. Anyone else? We probably have time for about one more question or comment or anything.
Maybe I could ask, because your last comment, Bonnie, has me thinking. It's telling the stories, and it's also talking about what are the habits and practices each of you undertake to do the self-reflective practice to allow you to be present. So in these different spaces. So Kimberly, you were talking about, you know, how you were thinking through in the moment when you were going into your Q&A session. But are there daily practices that you have that allow you to stay grounded as you think through these things? And because the day is like, it's hammering away. We got emails, we got this, we got everything is happening all the time. And the institution is trying to speed us up all the time to to do. And if we don't have habits of self-reflection and whether they're meditative or whatever they might be, but I would be interested in hearing more about that from you all, because that too is helpful for those of us who are trying to do that in our work.
So Chris, I hear a couple of things in that, and so I'm going to respond to that by just briefly mentioning around self-care, that when folks talk about, you know, what are you doing to kind of keep it together? And I talk about my self-care cocktail is my counselor, my trainer, and acupuncturist. And as long as I have those three, then I might be okay to keep it together. But if I hone in on one of those, I would really say that it's about the trainer. And that's because I have created a space that I show up at his gym at 5 a.m. and he lists and says, this is what I need you to do for the next hour. And then it becomes my time. Like there may be somebody crazy enough to email at 5 a.m., but there are very few people who are emailing at 5 a.m. I don't have a husband and children asking and needing something in that very moment either. So that after he gives me that routine that I need to follow through, that becomes my space, that I am with self. And if I am hitting a boxing bag, I might be thinking about a colleague, but I may also, but I'm also thinking and reflecting on how I'm working through something and how I want to show up in that space. You know, if I've got a hard conversation that I have to have that day, I'm working through it during that period. And again, because nobody seems to need you at that hour in the morning, it feels like the perfect space and time to do some of that self-reflection and figuring out how I want to grapple with something.
Yeah, you know, I have one of my best friends is trained as a sociologist, and now she works in organizational development. And in the last 2 years, I think, I find that when I'm chatting with her, even if we're just having a casual conversation, the phone will get very quiet to the point where I have to say, "Are you there?" She's like, "No, I'm here, I'm listening." You know, and then, you know, she'll send us these meditative things later from Brene Brown or whomever. So she's tries to be very grounded. But what I've learned from that is that power of silence, of listening. I recently did that when a colleague, my director of graduate studies, came to me with a concern and a complaint and blah, blah, all the things that ordinarily I would be like, well, here's what I think. And I was silent the whole time that they were talking, partly because I was listening, but I was also tapping into how am I feeling about what they're saying? How am I feeling about who's saying it, who the messenger is, and how do I separate those so that I can respond in a way that really reflects the concern and the care that I think is needed in this moment. But at the same time, also a little bit of my own irritation. I didn't want too much of that to supersede what the care and concern. So I had to be still and very silent. And I'm finding that more and more when people are talking to me, especially when they're coming to me with an acerbic tone and they're just really, I'm just silent, you know, to the point where are you listening to me? Yes, very much so. Because I have to be in touch with right now. If I respond to you right now, it's not going to be pretty. I know my personality. So I'm trying to take a lot of steps back to just listen very intensely and to listen very deliberately, not to respond, but to make sure I hear. Because sometimes when I do that, I'm hearing pain and frustration and exhaustion and all of the things, and just sometimes just anger. And so just trying to ground myself a little bit more in how I listen is one of the things that I've been trying to practice in the last several years.
And you know what I like about you saying that, Psyche, is we did 10 interviews with those who have applied to be in the third cohort. And one of the questions that we ask is, you know, what do you believe are the essential qualities of a good leader, and things that you would like to work on to help you get there? And consistently, listening has been one of the qualities that folks keep raising. So I find that really interesting that you are being very intentional about it, when on the other side, when you're talking to colleagues who are thinking about leadership but have not moved in that direction, that they are saying, you know, what I wish I saw more in leaders is this listening piece, that they are really, you know, actively listening, not just saying they're listening or I hear you, but really focused in and again, centering them as a human, a whole human being that wants to be heard in that particular space and time. So I think it's interesting that you've already tapped into that and see that as a part of what you need to do as a leader too.
Mm-hmm. And I think that also allows you to determine what things you need to respond to immediately, and what things you need to think about a little bit. You know, you need time to reflect upon what things, and so you are more, rather than being pushed into X, Y, and Z, that you're more intentional about how you approach those things. Well, it's 5 o'clock. So I really just want to thank you so much. I'm so happy I got a chance to share with my HuMetrics colleagues the wonderful conversations and why I love my Breaking the Mold colleagues. And also to share all of this, these workshops with all of you. And Chris, did you want to close out? I'm somebody's supposed to close out. I don't know who, but you got a minute to do it.
I think your closing was beautiful, Bonnie. It's wonderful to have the projects in dialogue, and we're looking forward to the ongoing conversation as we move into continuing to think together about what leadership looks and feels like as we move forward. So thank you all.
Thank you all. Have a good weekend.
Thank you. Same to you.
Take care.